Welcome to Stories Hub, a place for peaceful storytelling and quiet adventures. Before this story begins, I want to tell you something. Love does not always come at the right time. It does not always arrive in the right shape. Sometimes it comes like rain on a sunny day, soft, wrong, beautiful, and dangerous. This is the story of a boy who thought he understood love and a woman who believed her heart was already full. The boy's name was James. He was 17, quiet, and always thinking. He lived in a small coastal town in Brighton, where the sea stretched endlessly. The wind carried salt and stories, and the clouds often pressed low against the water. James loved quiet corners, the worn benches along the pier, the cafe at the corner of Elm Street where he could sit for hours, and the small library where books smelled of dust and rain. He believed that life could be simple, that love could be simple, but he had not yet learned that both could also be storms. The woman's name was Nora. She was 30, married, and lived in a yellow house not far from the shore. People said she laughed easily. They also said her husband, Daniel, was busy, always traveling, always thinking of work. Nora rarely spoke about her life, except in fleeting, careful words. She walked through town with a gentle smile that could light a room but carried a quiet distance. There was something in her presence that seemed to notice everything, yet revealed nothing. James first saw her on a rainy afternoon. He was standing outside the cafe, notebook in hand, scribbling verses that felt unfinished even to him. The sky had poured gently earlier, and the streets were wet with reflection. A car slowed near the yellow house, and Nora stepped out, balancing a bag of groceries. The wind lifted her scarf, and she laughed lightly, trying to catch it before it blew away. For a moment, James felt the world pause. He didn't fall in love that instant. What he felt was a stirring in his chest, a quiet curiosity, the faint echo of recognition. She belonged to another world, and yet, somehow, she belonged to his imagination. The next day, he found himself returning to the library. Not for the books, not really, but for her. She was sitting near the window, a small lamp casting light across her hair, reading quietly. James pretended to read, scribbling nonsense in his notebook, but his attention was on her. The way her eyes moved over the pages, the way she tilted her head slightly when she found a line she liked, the small hum she made almost imperceptibly when turning a page. It was then that their first words were exchanged. A book slipped from her lap, and James picked it up. "Here," he said softly, handing it to her. "Thank you," she replied, smiling just enough for him to notice, just enough for him to feel it in his chest. Her voice was calm, steady, a little musical. That smile stayed with him for hours, even after she had left the library. James began visiting more often, always finding reasons to linger. Sometimes they would talk about books, sometimes about the town, and sometimes just small, unimportant things. Yet, in each small conversation, the thread between them grew taut and warm. He learned that she loved sunsets and stories where the hero didn't always win. She learned that he wrote secret poems, scribbled in margins and notebooks, pieces of himself he had not shared with anyone. Days turned into weeks. One rainy evening, James saw her struggling with a small umbrella outside the library. He ran forward and offered to share it. They walked together, shoulders almost brushing, the rain drumming softly on the canvas above them. "You like the rain?" he asked, feeling the words come out almost unconsciously. "I love it," she said softly. "It washes everything, makes you feel alive, even when life feels heavy." That night, James wrote a poem about rain that stays inside a person long after it has fallen. The next day, he handed it to her quietly. She read it slowly, her eyes softening, then folded it and tucked it into her bag. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You have a brave heart for James." Those words were a warmth that settled in his chest, a light he could carry into every day. Weeks passed, and their connection grew quietly, slowly, like a plant reaching toward sunlight. They shared small smiles, quiet conversations, moments in which words were often unnecessary. But love is rarely patient. James began to realize he was in love with her, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified him. Nora was married. She belonged to another life, another person, and yet she made him feel alive in a way no one else had. He watched her, sometimes from afar, sometimes across the library table, wishing he could be the one she leaned on, even for just a fleeting moment. Nora, too, noticed him. There was a gentleness in his gaze, an attentiveness that she had long missed in her own life. Daniel was not cruel. He was simply absent in ways that left her unfulfilled. James did not need to speak much to make her feel noticed, understood, and alive. She would smile at him across tables, let him help her with books, share small jokes, and in those moments she felt that quiet, forbidden comfort that grew stronger with every encounter. One evening, as a storm rolled over Brighton, they found themselves walking along the pier under a shared umbrella. The wind whipped around them, waves crashed below, and the rain soaked through their coats. They laughed, unrestrained, at how ridiculous it was, at how utterly ordinary and yet extraordinary this felt. James wanted to reach for her hand, but stopped. He could feel her heartbeat in that moment as clearly as his own. The temptation was almost unbearable. Their closeness, however, did not go unnoticed. Daniel returned from a business trip and began to sense the subtle changes in Nora, the quiet smiles, the faraway look in her eyes, the little envelope she sometimes kept close to her chest. James' father also discovered one of his poems accidentally, and with gentle but firm words warned him to be careful with feelings that could bring pain. The walls of the world closed in around them, heavy with the weight of reality. One stormy evening, Nora asked James to meet her at the pier. The sky was a blanket of gray, the waves angry and relentless. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of what had grown between them. "We have to stop," she said softly. "Not because I don't care. I care too much. That's why." He wanted to argue, to tell her that their hearts were free, that love could survive anything. But in her eyes, he saw a courage that was fierce and necessary. She reached into her bag and placed an envelope in his hand. "This is goodbye," she said, "not to the feeling, but to the road we were walking." Inside was his own poem, folded many times, and a short note: "You taught my heart to listen again." They stood close, almost touching, and then she walked into the wind, disappearing into the storm. The months that followed were heavy with longing and quiet growth. James wrote more poems, walked the pier alone, and learned how absence could shape the heart. Sometimes he saw her from a distance, fleetingly, and their eyes would meet, and in that glance there was peace. Nora carried the memory of him quietly, reading his poems, smiling at the boy who had loved her so purely, a love that had demanded nothing. Years later, James published his first book of poems. On the first page, he wrote, "For the rain that taught me love can be true, even when it must end." And sometimes, when storms rolled into Brighton and the rain clung longer than it should, Nora would open the worn envelope with his words and remember. She did not feel sadness, only warmth and gratitude. Some love burns bright and quick, leaving nothing but ash. Some love smolders and leaves scars. But some love, the rarest kind, becomes a gentle light. It teaches, it grows, it shapes hearts, and it stays, quiet, enduring, infinite. And whenever the rain stayed longer than it should, James and Nora remembered that light, and it warmed them both. Even after years had passed, the memory of Nora lingered in James' life like the quiet hum of a familiar song. The town of Brighton had changed subtly. The cafe had a new owner. Some shops had moved. The piers would had darkened from storms. Yet everything remained the same in the way that mattered most to him. Every rainy afternoon, every gust of wind reminded him of her, of the small, tender moments that had quietly defined his youth. James had grown taller, his voice deeper, his writing sharper. He had learned the rhythm of life's responsibilities, the weight of expectations, and yet he carried within him the light of a love that had been impossible but profound. He remembered walking along the pier as a teenager, the rain soaking through his coat, laughing under the shared umbrella, the way Nora's hand had nearly touched his, and how that nearness had made the world feel infinite. Those moments were etched in him more clearly than any photograph, more vividly than any dream. Nora, too, lived with the echo of their connection. She had settled into her life, caring for her home, balancing her obligations with the small freedoms she allowed herself. Her husband, Daniel, was present in the ways he could be kind, consistent, but often emotionally distant. She had learned to fill the empty spaces with her own thoughts, her own small joys, and sometimes her memories of James. The poems he had written, folded carefully and kept in a drawer, had become her secret companions. On stormy evenings, she would read them, letting the words wash over her like rain, reminding her that someone had once seen her completely, understood her silently, and loved her without asking for possession. Their connection had never been about physical desire or rebellion. It was something quieter, subtler, yet infinitely more powerful. The recognition of a soul, the understanding that two hearts could beat in the same rhythm, even if they belonged to separate lives. James had loved her without needing her to reciprocate in the ways the world would approve. Nora had cherished his love without letting it disrupt the life she had built. That, in itself, was extraordinary. On particularly heavy rainy days, James would wander the streets near the pier, watching umbrellas bob along the sidewalks, listening to the steady drumming of rain on rooftops. He would sometimes stop near the yellow house, now slightly faded from sun and sea air, and imagine her standing at the window, smiling at him as she once had. The image was comforting, almost tangible, and it reminded him that love did not always need to be acted upon to exist fully. One day he returned to the library where it had all begun. The shelves smelled of paper and dust. The same wooden tables held the faint imprint of countless hands, and the quiet murmur of people reading was just as it had been. He found a corner, sat down with a notebook, and began to write again. This time the words flowed differently, not the awkward poems of a boy, but the reflective, measured verses of someone who had loved deeply, understood longing, and accepted the impermanence of human connection. He wrote about rain, about the sea, about moments that linger and shape the soul without needing resolution. Meanwhile, Nora walked along the same pier during a morning when the clouds were low and heavy. She carried a cup of tea, her coat buttoned tightly against the damp wind. She paused and looked at the horizon where the gray sky met the restless waves, and she remembered James, not with sadness, not with regret, but with gratitude. She remembered the laughter they had shared, the poems he had written, the quiet moments that had made her heart beat a little faster, even as she knew it could never be more. It was in these moments that she understood a profound truth. Love does not always demand fulfillment. Love can exist as a memory, a lesson, a light that guides even when the person it belongs to is no longer near. It was a love that taught her patience, courage, and awareness. It had given her a glimpse of the depth her own heart could reach, without needing to disrupt the life she had committed to. Years passed. James published his first book of poems, which quietly captured attention. He dedicated the first page to the rain and to the person who had awakened his heart. For the rain that taught me love can be true, even when it must end. The poems were full of longing and beauty, the kind that made strangers stop and reflect on their own hidden feelings. Some readers wrote to him, not knowing the story behind the verses, but sensing the quiet, enduring light that shone through them. Nora never read the book in public. She kept her copy at home, marked pages with a small bookmark, and sometimes read aloud lines that spoke directly to her memories. The words transported her, making her smile at the boy who had once loved her so purely. She never felt regret, only the warmth of being understood and the joy of remembering. There were days when they both walked along the pier at the same time, separated by distance, circumstance, and the unspoken rules of life. Their eyes would meet across the waves, perhaps only for a second, and yet the recognition was unmistakable. No words were needed. The rain, the wind, the sea, all bore witness to their invisible connection. And so life went on. James moved to the city for work, yet often returned to Brighton for quiet visits, always seeking the sea, always hoping to see the yellow house or the library window. Nora stayed in her home, fulfilling her commitments, yet always carving out space for the small joys of life. A good book, the smell of rain, the memory of a love that had transformed her understanding of herself. Some love burns bright and disappears, leaving only ashes. Some love smolders quietly, leaving scars. But some love, the rarest kind, becomes a gentle light, steady, illuminating, eternal. It does not demand, it does not force, it simply exists, shaping hearts, teaching patience, and leaving a mark that time cannot erase. And whenever the rain stayed longer than it should, James and Nora remembered that light. They remembered the boy who loved a married woman, and the woman who quietly allowed herself to be loved. They remembered the shared umbrellas, the rainy walks, the poems, the laughter, the stolen glances, and the moments that belonged entirely to them, even if only in memory. That love, instead of burning, had become a light, gentle, enduring, and infinitely beautiful. And in that light they both lived, carrying it with them quietly through the years, allowing it to shape their hearts, their choices, and their understanding of what it truly means to love.